This is Shannon Boucher, Ottawa, Ontario. Talking today about Parents' Rights Day of Action, June the 9th. An invitation to people across Canada to participate in a coordinated communication with our education ministers, with our school boards, and with our communities about our concerns about what's happening in our schools. My core concern is gender ideology, but there are entire mechanisms built around gender ideology in the school systems. And today, I'm going to share a little bit about a background about how that came about. We live in a world where people like to talk about human rights. And everywhere we go, and every interaction that we attempt to have with our schools, if we have some criticism, we get faced with a claim that's violating human rights. And these tactics are overreaches of authority and lies by school boards and by activist teachers and administrators to silence parents. Human rights are very specific rights, but the Human Rights Code in various jurisdictions across Canada have been weaponized to advance a specific ideology. That ideology is social justice, call it critical theory. Under critical theory is critical race theory and critical gender theory, also known as queer theory. Critical theory divides the world into two categories: oppressors and victims. And the identified oppressors in North America are white Christians, particularly white Christian males. And the identified victims get a score. It's not technically a score, but it's called intersectionality. And intersectionality means that people are more oppressed based on the number of intersecting oppression claims that they have. So on one hand, in feminism, the idea is that women are oppressed by the patriarchy. But in the 90s, a woman came along and said, well, I'm a black woman and I have a different level of oppression because I'm both a woman who's oppressed and I'm black and therefore oppressed, and so my oppression is different. And now we have oppression matrices that elevate certain types of people based on their oppression categories and rank order them. And what the human rights organizations have done across Canada is they have rank ordered oppression, even though they say there's not supposed to be any one right that has, or any one group that has precedence over another. They have rank ordered oppression, and they defend and protect people based on the doctrines and the legitimacy given to oppression claims. It sounds complicated. What it does is it teaches black kids in Canada that they're the victims of white people. It teaches Indigenous people in Canada that they're the victims of white people. And that we're going to judge people based on racial categories and stereotypes. And what we're teaching children in school is to judge people by the color of their skin, to make assumptions about people solely based on the color of their skin. Now, you would look at me and say, well, clearly I'm a European, a white male. But you wouldn't know that my grandparents came to Canada as refugees, that they were fleeing communist Russia, and a death warrant on my grandfather's head and his brothers-in-law for milling flour and going against the communist regime in the late 20s. You wouldn't know that they spent 5 years in a refugee camp. You wouldn't know that they spent 5 years indentured to CN Rail alongside Chinese rail workers in Canada building the railway. You wouldn't know that they worked as farmhands in the dirty 30s in the prairies and the conditions that they lived in. And you wouldn't know that what helped them buy a farm was hard work and dedication and to take opportunity. That's the opportunity that is extended to every single Canadian. Now, unfortunately, the stereotype about white people doesn't account for the fact that most white people in Canada have stories. Most Canadians are like me. And if you scratch the surface and you go back a generation or two or three at maximum, you will find almost universally that people have stories like mine. And we came to Canada because Canada is a place of opportunity and a safe place. We came here because of famines. We came here because of wars. We came here because of revolutions. We came here on boats. We came here across borders. We came here after walking many hundreds of miles to get across and away from the tyrants that were oppressing us in other nations in the world. And we came to Canada because we viewed Canada as a place where we could be who we are, where we weren't going to be oppressed by tyrants and regimes. And we could build a life with all other Canadians from all over the world in the dozens or hundreds of waves of migration that have come to Canada over the centuries. But we're teaching children in school that based on the color of your skin and based on the color of someone else's skin, this is how you judge a person's character. We are teaching racism. We're teaching children that gender identity means you can choose to be a boy or a girl. And we're doing it when kids are in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. These rainbow days, these LGBTQI celebration days are confusing children. K-8 schools doesn't belong there. Kids aren't sexual beings until they go through puberty. Leave the sex out of the school. Leave the books out of the school. Leave these radical ideologies out of the school and teach children the skills that they're going to need to live in the world that we live in. Not to build racial animus and hatred towards other people who might question their views. What can you do on June the 9th? Well, I'm taking inspiration from a group of group of Canadians who are strong in their beliefs and their convictions. Muslim Canadians don't make up a very large percentage of our population, less than 5%, but they've successfully kept kids home from schools on numerous occasions of rainbow celebration days. And Ottawa K-8 school last year kept 70% of the children home on Radical Rainbow Day in June. A London, Ontario school more than once has kept 30% of children home from school. School boards are not listening to parents. We can see that in the news about school boards over this last school year. They are incapable of handling controversial, grotesque issues like the shop teacher in Halton region with the giant prosthetic breasts. They become an international laughingstock. They are routinely censoring and silencing parents and abusing people who don't buy into their ideology. There seems to be no way to engage with these groups. Largely, we're disorganized. We're individuals. And as individuals trying to speak up, we don't have power. But groups have power. And we have the power to say no. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to think about June a little differently than plastered in rainbows. Think about June in red and white. Wear your red and whites and encourage your kids to wear red and whites. On June the 9th, keep your kids absent from school. Send a message because there's no bums in the seats. You don't have to talk to the principal. You don't have to beg to be heard about your concerns. Just don't be there. Plan a wholesome family day. Get together with other parents. Find out when the rainbow days are in your school. Plan for June, and there may be more than one. And plan to keep your kids home from those days. Just don't be there. Exercise your choice. Bring your values to your children, and don't let the schools take away your parental authority, which is what they're doing them by teaching these radical political divisive doctrines and radical gender ideology. They are teaching doctrines that are not yours. And it doesn't matter where you come from. I grew up in a Christian household. I'm not a practicing Christian. I've talked to Greek Orthodox people, I've talked to Catholics, I've talked to Protestants, I've talked to revivalists and Baptists and Muslims, and I've talked to Canadians who would call themselves secular atheists. Everybody is concerned about this. The time has come for us to come together, at least on this issue about protecting our children. Now, over the last couple of years, we have been led to believe that Canada is a genocidal nation, and I'm talking about the Indigenous residential schools. And we certainly have a history to contend with when it comes to those residential schools. That's troubling. My view, and I spent several years researching this. I did my undergrad honors writing thesis on Indigenous relations in Western Canada. I traveled through Western Canada and the United States, meeting with traditional knowledge keepers and storytellers. Now, I was a sidekick on that journey. I was traveling with what we would call a medicine man. And I traveled through British Columbia, Alberta, Montana, Idaho, Utah, and into Arizona over the course of about 7 weeks in 1997. And in that year, I had the honor to bear the weight of hearing survivor stories from notorious residential schools, just like, well, the Kamloops Indian Residential School, the school where the claim of 215 graves has been made. I've heard dozens of individual stories about going to that school and the abuses suffered by people who went to that school. Alberni School on Vancouver Island. I can tell you that there were serious abuses in the Canadian residential school system. And I heard those stories in the context of sacred healing circles, cathartic processes, invited into sweat lodges with elders, with people reconciling those egregious experiences and traumas from the past, and in more formal, large group, therapeutic and life skills workshops. I never heard about babies being thrown into furnaces or buried in the middle of the night. What I did hear about was corrupt schools. And the biggest sin, in my opinion, with respect to the Indigenous residential schools in Canada, was that there was no safeguarding for children. They were a haven for predators. And that the state established those schools in collaboration with the churches with an idea that the state and the churches knew better than the families of the children in those schools. Now, this is an oversimplification. But what we have right now in Canada is a situation where the state and this nice sounding human rights doctrine, which is actually taking away people's rights, has decided that this doctrine is the new state religion, that human rights is the new moral code to be enforced in the country. It's a secular religion. It bakes in all of these things: the intersectional identity, the racial oppression ideas, the gender identity and ideology, and the hierarchy of victims. We need to stand up in Canada. We need to take back our rights as parents. We need to say no to this kind of indoctrination, which claims to be anti-hate, but is really teaching children to hate each other and to be afraid of each other. June the 9th, please stand up.